Turn, turn, we gotta turn, turn, we gotta turn, turn, we gotta turn, turn, we gotta. The seas are rising, but the struggle's long. We're gonna turn history, turn it around, and the CEO's got money.
Yeah, so for me, like I said, I started thinking about this stuff way back when I was only 17 years old in Minneapolis, and our project then was the Honeywell project was to try to resist and convince Honeywell Corporation from manufacturing cluster munitions, which were being shipped directly to Vietnam and were anti-personnel weaponry. And our movement was, or our campaign was hijacked by agents provocateurs who helped to foment a violent wing or a violent flank to this campaign and basically wrecked it. And then later on, we were able to, with the help of the American Civil Liberties Union and other really great lawyers, to prove in court that there had been these agents provocateurs who had infiltrated our movement and had promoted the sort of violence that basically disaffected the public so much. So it's been, for me, a steady stream of this all the way through. I moved to northern Wisconsin through treaty rights struggles to reaffirm the treaty rights of the Anishinaabe people there, and I worked very closely with them, especially with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and other Native groups, and then moved to Portland and have continued the work here. I will say right now that in anticipation of possible very logical, challenging questions about, well, how do you explain what the current sort of situation is in Portland? And all I can say with regard to that is I will not arrogate to myself the role of being the white advisor to Black Lives Matter. This is something that I've just been staying out of in terms of trying to influence the notion of the violent flank that we have seen. And I know a lot of these people, or at least I know some of them. And right now, just to really for me, set the stage of where I think we're at nationwide is we are now in a both and, a new situation of preparing to engage in election protection and defending democracy. So this moves for me into sort of a next phase. So I'm going to run through these slides fairly quickly. If somebody has a burning issue and they need this to stop, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll just kind of skim through these and then we will go into a more of a free-for-all discussion at the end. So let's hope that this works. Yay, can everybody see this?
Yeah,
Okay,
raise
I'm
your
seeing
hand
nods.
if you can see it. Raise your hand if you can see it. Screen share? Okay, we're getting a number of hands up, Tom. I think we're okay.
Okay, so yeah, what this is looking at is the existence of and how do you inoculate your campaign or your movement against the sort of deleterious effects of, okay, now I'm hitting, oh, there we go. So a violent flank is simply it's the group in a campaign that decides to use violent tactics. And Brian Martin wrote, I think, a really good book on this called Backfire. He's an Australian peace and conflict studies professor and an activist. And my assertion is all violence backfires. So the violence that's done by the police backfires against them quite often. The violence that's done in the context of a protest movement is harmful to that protest movement. And in some ways, it can be boiled down to first side to use nonviolence completely wins. So some of the effects of the violent flank include it reframes your actions and it buries your message. It scares and alienates the public, and I put in a link here to a Stanford study that kind of backs that up. it reduces recruitment of new participants because of the fear, because of the alienation of the violent flank. It justifies the repression, tends to make the police more aggressive, and it makes the campaign organizers and participants more paranoid. And special to right now, it is giving the advantage to Trump. So inoculation includes a number of measures, including achieving early consensus on the message, early consensus on a nonviolent code of conduct, to create an image to the wider public that you are in fact nonviolent or family friendly, your peaceful protest, however you want to frame it. Some people regard nonviolent as a loaded word, fine. Family friendly works just great. Or when I was working on treaty rights struggles, they just called it, quote, the Anishinaabe way. What they meant was the same thing that we're talking about. And they got that image across. So creating that image and then defending that image is very crucial to that defense against the violent flank. So consensus on message simply means that as you are creating your campaign, that decisions that you make should be run through this filter of how will this affect recruitment? Because if it's going to negatively affect recruitment of more participants into your campaign, then perhaps you should think about that as a factor in your decision. And to have your image be very invitational, your message is invitational, and you have basically a single message, not an unalterable 17-point list of demands, but rather a fairly simple message that you want, a goal that you're announcing that you want to achieve. And the code of conduct, Gandhi had a code of conduct. Here's one example from Dr. King, from one of his early books. This is something that is up to each campaign to come up with, but deciding early on in that campaign so that you have a relatively tight a group of organizers who say, well, this is our code of conduct, and then make that code of conduct a precondition for coalition, for participation, that is not up for debate. There are plenty of things to debate all along the way. But if you get hung up on revisiting this question again and again and again, your campaign will almost certainly stall out. I really advocate having that code of conduct printed out and signed. And everybody who's engaging in this is actually carrying a copy of that they have signed. This is literally proof. This is what I'm interested in. This is what I commit to. Share it with your arresting officer or with any other police. Share it with media if they have questions for you. But it really helps. It's like a validation that this is something that I'm committed to. And part of creating and defending that image is to have an organizer who is a liaison to the police to explain to them again and again. This is like rinse, repeat, rinse, rinse, repeat, rinse. Again and again, you're relentlessly explaining your code, your nonviolent status, and your commitment to this. And then another person to the media. Sometimes this is handled by a peace team. Sometimes it's just one of the core organizers, or maybe a team that's working with law enforcement or with media. And then obviously maintaining discipline is crucial. I put in a little link that I just got. This is from TMZ, and it shows a group of indigenous activists down at the border wall who are being really harassed and even physically, shoved and stuff by this one irate white woman. And these indigenous activists really gentle this person down and maintain nonviolent discipline in every sense, even when she's reaching out to grab their face masks, to shove them, etc. It's just a great example, I think, of maintaining that nonviolent discipline. So to control the effects, again, focus on the behavior code, have peace teams that can really amplify and reiterate the message of the core organizers. This is the code of conduct that the core organizers are asking. They announced it from the stage. They announced it on advertising and promotional material ahead of time. And they've asked us to be here to remind you of this. And reaching out to the violent flank, I'm not talking about during an event, but I'm talking about in between times. Reaching out to them and framing this to them as mutual respect and negotiating with them so that you establish a relationship with people that you have identified as they're with the violent flank, whether it's Antifa or, they used to call themselves the Black Bloc, the anarchists or whatever, but establishing that relationship on a one-to-one basis, almost like Dorothy Day's gentle personalism, is really key. And I know this from direct experience here in Portland. It actually works. What doesn't work, in my experience, is attempting to frame it as a moral, we are more moral than you. That doesn't work so well. And the other thing that doesn't work so well, in my experience, is framing it as you are really not being very smart strategically. Those two arguments to me are kind of losers when it comes to doing outreach to and negotiating with violent flank people. What works is, how about if we engage in something that involves mutual respect? How about if we say, if you come to our event, you're welcome. We want you there, but here's the code of conduct we expect from everybody. You do not want to violate the code of conduct that we expect while you're in our event, and we won't denounce your event if it's done on the other side of town and you break some windows. That's your business. In other words, establishing that you have the right as organizers to expect this, and that actually works, or at least it has in my experience. So focusing again and again on nonviolent discipline is just crucial, and that's why the peace team is necessary, and so are ongoing and routine trainings. And what happens is, over a period of time, you gradually build trust. You build trust in the public, in law enforcement, in the media, et cetera, et cetera. Trust by the public can backstop barriers to repression by armed agents of the state. In other words, if the police know that you have this great reputation, they are much less likely to say, go in high, hard, and heavy and start beating on these people because they know that that is going to backfire on them. Now, if your group is infiltrated by violent flank and it jumps off into something that the police then have an excuse for, then all bets are off, right? So building that trust is a process, and building trust by the public can influence deciders of policy. So at this point in most workshops, I would stop for role play number one. I'm sure most people on this Zoom call have done this, the waterfall. You just have, or a hassle line, you just face off against each other and you're practicing being able to kind of take it. That you are saying to yourself, for today, this campaign is bigger than me. I can take this heckling, I can take this, and I won't respond. So that's sometimes it's called hassle line, sometimes it's called waterfall. We're not going to do that tonight because we're zooming along. And I just a note here, and this is a great book. It's kind of academic, but also kind of fun. This young Thai scholar wrote this book about the use of humor, strategic use of humor in the struggle that Bruce mentioned earlier, engaged by youth activists in Serbia, who led the struggle and the successful struggle using nothing but nonviolence to overthrow the so-called Butcher of the Balkans. I mean, this guy Milosevic had rape camps, concentration camps of starvation. Nothing like that had been seen since World War II. The massacre of 7,500 unarmed Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica, et cetera, et cetera. and they used humor, and they used it strategically. And Sumbat Mansuri really goes through how this is very effective. So Pete, and this is, for those of you from Portland, you know this. This is the guy who murdered a couple of people on the MAX train and seriously wounded another, Jeremy Christian, and he was identified with this whole Patriot Prayer group. He's self-identified Nazi. He's, you know, in prison for his murders. But I will say this, that we were able to de-escalate every time the peace team was invited out to an event where there would be the Patriot Prayer alt-right, and also there would be Antifa. We would advise the organizers, please ask the police not to even show up. And when the police did sort of fade away and weren't in sight, we were able to maintain nonviolent discipline on all sides. No violence broke out. That happened every time. I should knock on wood that it continues. But so far, the Portland Peace Team has been far more effective in de-escalating those situations than the Portland police. So the violent flank can be, to me, very, very easily neutralized if we take away the provocations. And education is part of this too. So this is just simply the kind of the ultimate empirical research that was done on violence and nonviolence. And this is becoming so generalized into our movements that it's really, I'm qualified as an expert in courts to help nonviolent civil resistors defend themselves. So I get tapped by lawyers to come in, and I'm able to say, because I talk to the activists on trial, and I say, so do you know about this research? And they all do. This is the beautiful part of this research, is that it's becoming really generalized into our activist community. And what it shows, of course, is that this stuff actually works. And reducing and eliminating the violent flanks is a great way to promote the success of a campaign or a movement. And I think it's really helpful to think about all of the power paradoxes in nonviolence so that you de-escalate in order to enable escalation of your movement. You are more vulnerable in order to increase your invulnerability, and not hitting back is hitting back the hardest. So training, training, training. And all of these trainings are not in vain. So I will go through a little bit of this, a little bit more, but suffice it to say that we want no end to the trainings. They're kind of relentlessly available. And this is the method we use. It's used by a lot of international nonviolent unarmed civilian protection groups like Nonviolent Peace Force. It's kind of the gold standard. It started out as the LoRa, the listen, affirm, respond, and add information. And I will say, as a point of Portland pride, that the advocates for gay marriage started using this and developed, they created the LoRa method back in the 90s when they were going door to door to promote initiatives that would allow gay marriage. Then international groups took this and added the C. They said, no, first we have to calm and center, and then we can do the rest of this. And they were correct, and this Clara method is the one that we use. So this would be the second role play. If we were going to do that, now we're up, instead of just one person facing off against another, we've got three people: one aggressor, one angry demonstrator, and one peace team de-escalator. But we're not going to do that one. And here's where I really want to emphasize continuing to do trainings. There's no such thing as I've had nonviolence training, so I don't need any more. This can be high stress and dangerous, and professionalizing our work is like many other high stress frontline workers: EMTs, soldiers, emergency room nurses, police, social workers, I mean, even bartenders, right? they have to know what to deal with or how to deal with people that are escalating. And well, I don't know about the bartenders, but everybody else gets repeated training because that gives them the advantage. So I referred earlier to this. I don't need to sort of dwell on this, but this mutual respect is really crucial. And this is just kind of an image, I think, of part of the power of nonviolence. There's this one little Japanese woman in front of all of these heavily armed and all geared up, and it's like, well, who has the power in this? And I think that's kind of an interesting question for those of us who want to think about nonviolence. So this really works well with students. I have about 300 students every year that go through my classes, and this is one of the role plays that I do with them. And this is a real learning moment for students, and I would suggest for activists too. Role play a media conference. And what it does is it gives those who are making these arguments a chance to really sharpen their pencils, because other people play the part of reporters, and they're instructed, ask the tough questions. And this is so helpful to activists to be able to field those hard questions to the people who are role-playing media. And to do this liaison work with law enforcement, I think is clearly important. You want to establish this trust. You want to disabuse them of the notion that anybody's going to be their, quote, eyes and ears. No, we don't have any police agents in our movement. We'll do our own security the way that works best, and we can achieve peace in the valley a lot faster than you can. And also to ask them very pointedly, to challenge them, do not use and promise you will not use agents provocateurs. If you have confidential informants that are infiltrating us, fine. We can deal with them. In fact, they'll come back to you and say, wow, this group really is nonviolent. You don't need to gear up so high and hard against them because they really mean it. So I don't discourage confidential informants at all. In fact, we've turned them. One FBI confidential informant that infiltrated the Plowshare movement, which I've been part of, and he also infiltrated the anti-invade Nicaragua movement in the 1980s. At the end of about something like a year and a half of infiltrating us, he quit the FBI and became a Catholic worker in Detroit. So I kind of like, well, fine. You want to infiltrate us, bring it on, but not agents provocateurs. They come into our groups and they promote violence, they promote chaos and discord, and they do a number of other things that's very negative and that's very unethical for the government or anybody to do this in a democracy. We have a right to dissent, and especially we have a right to nonviolent dissent. So for them, and I try to get a promise from Mayor Wheeler and from the previous, we go through chiefs of police in Portland faster than they go through vice presidents in Afghanistan. I mean, it's like a merry-go-round, a turnover. But one of the chiefs and Wheeler had a public hearing last year, and I said, you got to promise not to use agents provocateurs. And they look like the old cartoon of where you see visible question marks emitting from the backs of their heads. It's like, what are you talking about? I said, look, can I come up and give you my card? And we'll talk later. And so they said, sure. So I did. And of course, they never contacted me. But that's, I think, really important, is that we continue to pressure public officials and chiefs of police. Do not do this. This is unethical. It's actually illegal in some jurisdictions. So that the final role play that I usually use is one demonstrator holding a sign, another alt-right counter-demonstrator, one Antifa, one peacekeeper, one media. And then after it's done, you ask the media person, because Antifa and the alt-right are engaging, and they're in a conflict, and the one poor peacekeeper maybe can't de-escalate them. So you ask the media person, what's the story? What's the lead? And they say inevitably, it's a clash between Antifa and the alt-right. And that's the point of having your group known and being able to inoculate against the violent flank, because you went to all the trouble to organize this, and the story is not about your message. Your message is completely obfuscated and occluded from the story. Maybe it hits down there in, paragraph 11, but that's not the point. You want your demonstration to be, very assertive. It may not even be peaceable. It may be loud, but you want it to be nonviolent and you want it to be on message. You can't do that so easily if somebody's coming in and jumping up and down on the roof of a police car, and that's the mild stuff. I mean, now we're up to Molotov cocktails inside the police cars. If that stuff is going on, it's going to lead. And so you want to use every method that you can possibly use to inoculate against that. So the continuum of effectiveness starts with, well, if you have a violent flank, that's least effective. If you're basically have an apathetic public, that's not very effective. If you have actual nonviolent resistance, that's the most effective. I'm done. So let's open it up. And this is not just questions from me, but if you have comments to and from each other, you all know your organizations. This can be as far as I'm concerned, it can be a self-facilitated group discussion. And
So Tom, we'll go ahead and have folks, if they can, use the chat function to get the questions in there, since I'm not sure if you can see everybody on the screen. We've got 36 people. I think it's more than what can fit on one screen, but we can certainly try having people raise their hands. If you go to gallery view, you might be able to see 20 or so, and then flip to the second screen.
I think I'll stop the share so that this will be easier for everybody to see everybody.
There you go. Yep.
Okay.
Can you write in mine?
And there is a first question. Janice, you go ahead.
So Tom, if, if the group that is organizing protest has already done the best that they could do, but there is a violent flank that shows up at a demonstration, what are some successful things that the peace marshals or the peace peace team have done to deal with the violent flanks so that doesn't become the main story?
Yeah, for example, we had a march of a rally and a march of about 40,000 of us here in Portland, years ago when we were trying to stop the invasion of Iraq. And Michael Kerrigan from Eugene and I had trained in 90 peacekeepers. So we had a serious amount of helpers all along the way. And I didn't even see this particular incident, but it was reported back to me. There was a young guy, and I sort of mentioned this earlier. There's a young guy who was kind of losing it and was jumping up and down on the roof of a police car. And so what the peace team did was we cordoned off the area, and I say we in the sort of editorial sense of several members of the peace team cordoned off the area and asked everybody else, please keep moving along, that we'll watch out for his safety, which peace team members did, so that he wasn't beaten senseless by the police, but just keep on moving. This is not associated with us. And because of the media work that we had already done ahead of time, the media did report that happening. This young guy jumped up and down on the roof of a police car, but they contextualize it carefully by saying, but this was clearly not affiliated with the large march that was happening. That's kind of the best we can ever do, is say, when the media reports it, that's journalism. I mean, I've been a journalist for a lot of years. I actually have a master's in journalism, and I teach a course called Peace Journalism. And guess what? If it bleeds, it leads. We all know that. That will never change. But in the direct work with media, when people are being from the peace team or from the core organizers, when you are liaising with the media, you want to really help them to understand that the best professional journalism includes that it's just great to continue doing what you're going to do anyway. You have to talk about anything that jumps off, but you should also know that, look at this media packet that we've done. It stresses nonviolence throughout. We've got peace marshals or march moms or whatever you want to call us all over the place, and we're containing this behavior. So that's how you should report it. And to their credit, the local Fox affiliate, that particular day, they were trying to record all this, and they were knocked down. The cameraman was actually knocked down by one of the black bloc people, and they put paint on the lens of his camera. So they knocked this cameraman down, and to the credit of this local news affiliate, they reported it the way that we wanted. They said, you know, this happened to us, but it was clearly not related to the march, to the organizing that had happened. So to me, it's like I really go back to that Dorothy Day gentle personalism. Everything is about relationships. You know, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. When we get to know all the figures that we are, you know, dealing with locally, these things can be done, I think, very effectively. I mean, we did the same thing in northern Wisconsin with Native American treaty rights. The very first time that the American Indian movement came up to, quote, help, the only violence that ever happened on the part of Native Americans was done by an AIM person who shoved a guy over a police barricade and broke his arm. And the local Native American leadership from the Ojibwa or Chippewa or Anishinaabe tribes told AIM, now you have to go back to Minneapolis. You are not helping, and you can only come back when you understand this is our movement, our campaign. This is reservation-based, it's spiritually based, and when you can help us understanding that we are the leaders of this, then you're welcome to come back. And to their credit, AIM did go back to Minneapolis and met and figured it out and came back and said, we want to honor your leadership. And then from that point on, they were helpful. They didn't do anything physical to anybody. Even despite a lot of provocation, it was open, overt racism. Tribal members handled that with a deeper amount of grace than I've almost ever seen in my whole life.
Tom, do you have any other stories about successful moves at the demonstration itself in quelling the violence? Like planning ahead to have the marchers go to the other side of the street if the agent provocateurs and Antifa decide to do violence against, with the stores. Do you have stories of how people have just said, okay, we're going to deter the march elsewhere, or we're going to surround somebody that obviously has weapons and not let them out of the circle? Or do you have any other stories?
Well, I mean, some of it is dependent on how many folks we have out there. And while we have some peace team members who are, and this is in the literature about this, there are some people who strongly advise start recruiting from the participants when you need them to help you. I'm a little bit more hesitant personally. I don't like to kind of throw people in harm's way. But what we have done, for example, we were approached by a Bhutanese refugee, a guy I've known since he came to this country years ago, and he said, and he has he's a community organizer, and he said, on the 1-year anniversary of Trump's Muslim ban, he said, we're going to have a demonstration at the airport. Can you come out and be the peace team there? And I said, of course. And so a bunch of us went out, and there were maybe, starting off with just maybe 200 or 300 people there, kind of contained in an area. And I had asked him, the same thing I always ask is, can you please ask the police to just stay out of sight? I know they're going to be there, but can you ask them to stay out of sight? Because they're very provocative just by showing up. And he did, and the police cooperated. By that time, the police, they know us. And so they actually do kind of cooperate with us for the most part. And so they stayed away. You couldn't see them anywhere. And so the alt-right showed up, the Patriot Prayer, and literally within 30 seconds of them being there, they had shoved a guy right in the chest. And so 2 or 3 of us made a beeline for this kind of alpha male, and he was actually in one of the slides, and sort of just hung with him to make sure that this was not going to continue, which it didn't. We de-escalated him enough so that he didn't commit violence, but we were amazed after about an hour and a half into this, maybe a couple hours into it, where they had been highly offensive. I mean, they must have quite a t-shirt budget. Like, they had a t-shirt, everybody had new t-shirts in this alt-right group, or Patriot Prayer, and all of them had a different, highly inflammatory, insulting message about Islam or whatever. They were just unbelievably way past rude. They were just flat out offensive. And so we just really stuck with them the whole time. After this period of time, when we had to physically interpose at points between Antifa and them, because things were escalating. So we got right in between, and basically we turned to Antifa at that point and told them, basically, you got to hit us before you hit them. And that actually worked. And in the middle of all this, after, like I said, an hour and a half or so, this young woman suddenly got the attention of this alpha male, and he was live streaming himself. So he was the show. So he was like, I'm going to remain at, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm 11. And, to keep on being aggressive and loud and insulting, because he's the show. So he's got this selfie stick, he's live streaming himself to his crowd, and I can't de-escalate him. I try to give him a business card from PSU, and I said, I'd like to set up a dialogue session with you at PSU. And we've all got our little blue vests on, Portland Peace Team. He took my card and just threw it on the ground. It was like, okay, well, I tried. And this young woman, however, somehow or the other convinced him that she wanted to hear what he had to say. And she did. She's this tiny little woman, turned out from Iraq, and she listened to him, and she basically took him out of play. And by taking him out of play, it was like taking the general out of play, and the rest of the forces were like stock still for the rest of the time. And he even started asking her questions and listening to her. I'm assuming at that point he took off his live stream because they were just engaged. I mean, they had eye contact. I was watching them dumbfounded by her ability, her natural ability. At the end, I asked her, after the whole thing was done, I asked her, can you please join the peace team? And she said, well, I would love to, but I'm just starting medical school. So we kind of lost this amazing recruit. But then when everything was done, after about 3 hours or so, we're all leaving, and the biggest guy on the alt-right, I mean, they were, generally a bunch of strapping fellows. His name is Tiny, and people from Portland all know him. He's got this big rep of, he goes into demonstrations and just decks people. In fact, there was a bench warrant on him, and they finally did arrest him. But that day he was there and definitely ready to rock and roll. And by the end of the day, I think because of this young Iraqi woman and the fact that we had interposed between and kept everybody from beating the snot out of each other, that I was able to actually go up to him, and I had never even been introduced to him, but he had seen me around, I had seen him around, and I actually put my hand on his shoulder. And I said, thanks for not decking anybody today. And it was just like one of those moments where when we train people, we train them, don't touch other people. You don't know what that's going to do. That's dangerous. But I really strongly felt like at that moment, after all these hours, that we had established something. And so I was able to do that. And he was actually kind of smiled at me and was like, because I was acknowledging, what a big tough guy he was. So he kind of liked that. I have found that to be a really good de-escalating technique, just to acknowledge to people and to ask them, do you know how intimidating you are? And for somebody who's desperately trying to be intimidating, that's like, it's like giving a cat catnip. I mean, it's like, oh, that's the nicest thing you could have said to me. And it really helps them to de-escalate in the sense that, well, I guess I don't have to prove myself, since obviously I've already proven myself.
Are there other questions? We've got comment on the role of an effective police liaison, and then a couple more, but go ahead and take that one, Tom.
I mean, this stuff really works to get to know people. When we were trying to shut down a thermonuclear command center back when I lived in Wisconsin, we built trust, and we did liaison. And I put out all the media releases, and I always sent a copy of everything to all the local media, but also to the police, to the actual sheriff's department. So that they could see our transparency. Transparency is a real strong tool. Secrecy is a real negative thing. I mean, nobody likes it when everybody surprises everybody else. So being transparent with law enforcement, to me, is a great way to basically help to sideline them, because they're not coming out. I mean, the first time we went there, we found out to this military base, we found out that they had been there for something like 6 hours before, and fully geared up in all riot gear. And then, we showed up when we said we were going to show up. We did what we said we were going to do, which was nonviolent resistance. We sat down in a nonviolent blockade, and we were all arrested. But it took time. And over a period of time, they started trusting us to the point where one of the sheriff's deputies said to one of the local media, well, I'm due to retire in a couple of years, then I'm going to join them, pointing to us. And then a couple of years later, a second deputy said pretty much the same thing. Well, as soon as I retire, I'm going to join this resistance. I think it's just establishing that trust, and it's not something you can do like instantly. It's something that, again, takes personal relationship, but it also takes the nonviolent discipline, because they watched us when we went out the second or third time. Several of us were attacked physically by Navy personnel, and not by the local law enforcement, but by Navy personnel, because this was a Navy base. It sent commands to nuclear submarines. The Trident submarines that all y'all know from the Seattle area, Bremerton area. And when we maintained absolute nonviolent discipline despite these attacks on us, that built our credibility and our trust with the local law enforcement even more. I mean, it was kind of interesting because I was doing construction work back then as my, daytime job because I was a single dad to 2 boys. I had to try to make some money. And my activism was like what I did on the side until, finally in the 1980s, I became a full-time community organizer. But during these early days, then we established this trust so significantly with the local law enforcement that when it came time to work on the head jailer, and his wife was also a jailer, they called me to do the work on their house. They gave me a key to their house. I mean, this is the level of trust that I think is it's just really important to try to establish that.
Tom, we've also got, how do you find flank members and negotiate with them? I mean, how do you try to get ahead of the game and get to the flank folks before they're right there in your face causing trouble?
Yeah, and I was not used to this when I was in Wisconsin because our lead organizers and the first ones who started us on all of this were actually veterans of the civil rights movement. So they came to us with a philosophy and a code of conduct that we all said, oh, okay, that's what we do. Because they had been active in like Freedom Summer in 1964 and everything. And so my initial training was like, oh, this is how all movements are. No, when I learned better in some ways when I went back to Minneapolis and once again got involved with the Honeywell Project and others, but then came out to Portland and yeah, things were. I mean, there's a reason that the Secret Service called Portland Little Beirut. That there's always this background rate of people who are into a so-called diversity of tactics. So in some of the organizing meetings early on to oppose the invasion of Iraq, for example, they called themselves the Anti-Authoritarian Affinity Group. And so I did get to know some of them because they came to the organizing meetings, at least for a little while, until we adopted a strict nonviolence code. Then they sort of stopped coming. But since I had gotten to know some of them, then when they showed up at our demonstrations, then I was able to sort of get to know them a little bit better. And there was this young guy. He now is a community supported agriculture farmer out in Forest Grove. But he and I, his name is Chris, he and I would bike all over town just to meet with these folks who we had identified as being part of the violent flank. And that's where we established those relationships and started those negotiations. And we really did try every method of argument. And, we failed better, tried again, failed better, try again, until finally that what I call the mismovement manners, mutual respect argument finally did actually work. But I think you just have to be there. And now it's harder, I think, because everybody's wearing masks. Now it's like, it kind of changes all the dynamics. So that's an extra challenge for everybody, I think, right now.
So Tom, I think we're getting close to our hour-long time limit. One question that I had for you was regarding tactics. I think that most of us, when we think of a peace team or peacekeepers and a violent flanks, we automatically assume that we're at a large rally or a march where there's a lot of people, and then all of a sudden off on the fringe, somebody starts doing something violent. The media picks up on it, the police come in. But marches and rallies are only 2 tactics that a nonviolent campaign can use. And having them unorganized, without affinity groups, without any kind of disciplined organization like the Nashville sit-ins, which were, planned out by the Kingians, the King campaign. They designed it very closely. Do you have thoughts about how nonviolent campaigns could or should use tactics that are not quite so vulnerable to agents provocateurs and to radical or violent flanks?
I mean, it's really interesting to think about this because when we look at the history of who does get all the attention from and sustained attention from violent flanks, it's usually the campaigns that are open to it. And so if you sort of relentlessly make yourself not open to it, they kind of realize, yeah, this is not really working for us. It's really not very fun because we're regarded as kind of like pariahs when we come into their stuff. I mean, it was really brought home to me most vividly by two things. One is that when I was 17, I was all gung-ho. I mean, I was very influenced at that young age by the Black Panthers. And in my hometown, the sort of affiliate with the Black Panthers called themselves the Shaka Zulu Warriors. And I mean, that was great with my 17-year-old value system. And I never came to a settled philosophy on nonviolence until I was almost 30. And along the way, as a young activist, I mean, I picked up 2 assaulting a police officer charges. So I have a lot of sympathy for young people who are going through that struggle to come to grips with their own sort of philosophy. So looking at the history of the Black Panthers, I subscribed to their newspaper. I worked with them in Des Moines, Iowa, and there they were a Black Panther Party chapter. A little bit in Chicago, where I lived on the South Side for a little while. And they were infiltrated like crazy because they were so infiltratable. And it destroyed them. I mean, they went through a period of time. The Black Panther Party actually shut down all acceptance of any new members because they knew that they were being infiltrated. Their paranoia level was through the roof. I mean, they were getting murdered. And so basically that was a death spiral for the Black Panthers because they were open to infiltration. Because when you promote violence, when you say, no, we're not going to do any like offensive violence, but we will act in armed violent self-defense. And it's absolutely justified by just war doctrine or any other sort of normal justifications. The problem is it doesn't work. Then, and as Bruce well knows, because he was a participant in this, James Lawson and I have worked together for years in his institute. In fact, I was in the very first core team of advisors that he asked to come to Los Angeles to meet with him in 2012 to start planning what would ultimately become the James Lawson Institute. And the 6th iteration of that was the one that Bruce came to in Portland. I was the host at Portland State University. And James Lawson was pretty much one of the main architects of the United States freedom struggle, or the American freedom struggle, or what is commonly called the civil rights movement. And I asked him point blank, so pretty much the same question that Bruce, you just asked me. How did you basically inoculate yourself against violent flanks? And he said, we never had a problem with that. They didn't because they got ahead of it. Nobody would want to try to infiltrate them because with that agenda, because their code of conduct was clear as a bell, they had the moral authority of all these ministers saying, we're nonviolent. So that was not a problem that they had. And so their movement grew and grew and grew. And it only diminished after basically the outbreak of armed self-defense, riots, etc. As soon as the windows started breaking and which is I agree with the organizer in Chicago who said it's all the looting is justified. That's great. But justifying something is very different than having it be effective. So it's like, that was revelatory for me to hear Reverend Lawson say just flat out, we didn't have that problem. That should be a lesson to all of us, I think.
Well, we've got a number of other questions. I don't want to stretch people too far, but you're free to go. I think the one thing I would say here, and then we can go longer if people want to, you can stay a little longer. There have been some questions about, are there trainings for peacekeepers or peace team that will be offered? Are there people that are interested? And Tom, I asked him ahead of this if he would be willing to help, lead some training, and he said yes, that he would. And the regional council of the FOR, just our last meeting, was talking about doing this. And there's also workshops being put on by Training for Change, anticipating the contingency that Trump may lose the election, claim fraud, and refuse to leave, thereby being tantamount to a coup. Somewhat a little bit backward, but essentially an illegal power grab. And the research that's been done shows that it's mass protest that has been the most effective at combating coups, and those that have been well-trained and prepared and maintain good discipline are the ones that are most likely to succeed. So there's training on September 23rd and September 30th, training again, I think October 1st and October 6th on the Training for Change website, or Choose Democracy. What I would ask people, if you're interested in learning about being on a peace team or helping with maintaining nonviolent discipline at upcoming demonstrations, put your name in the chat or send a quick email to wwfor@wwfor.com and let us know, and we will get word out to all the people who are interested for the upcoming trainings in both those departments. With that, let me go back to the questions. The next question that I see, Tom, is any thoughts on how to deal with the mantra diversity of tactics? And you mentioned this in your last answer a little bit ago, but any thoughts on dealing with diversity of tactics when it is expressed at coalition building meetings by potential partners for an action, when it appears intended to silence any critical discussion of potential violent acts by those action partners, how such actions can undermine other groups' nonviolent tactics, strategic commitment to nonviolence, etc. Now, how do you deal with the diversity of tactics argument in a coalition setting when you're trying to persuade we need to maintain a nonviolent discipline?
Yeah, I think I look to history again. My most popular course that always fills is called Nonviolence in History, because people like to learn from what has happened. It's kind of like Kenneth Boulding said, can we agree that if it's happened, it's possible? And so, dealing with the diversity of tactics most effectively is to make that early decision that, okay, we're going to start a coalition, but we're starting small. You look at what Otpor did. They started with a group of about 6 or 7 Serb kids. And they said, this is how we decide things, and this is our code of conduct. And that's a condition. Those things are a condition of joining us. So to me, the idea that bringing in more coalitional partners and allowing for a diversity of tactics in order to bring in some groups, that is a great way to basically stall the momentum that you had hoped to create by bringing in more people. You will, if you're thinking in net numbers, that really helps. Because if you attract a handful of people who really want to just get out and rock and roll, that's great, and you will alienate probably a couple orders of magnitude number more from joining you. So it is a net loss, and this is something that I think that if you don't decide it early, it's like this was a problem with some of the occupies. Every occupy was different, as I'm sure you all know. I mean, I visited a bunch of them. I'm sure a lot of you visited this occupy and that occupy, and it's like there was no mothership. Yeah, they called it Occupy Wall Street, and that might have been the first, but every occupy was autonomous. I can tell you in Portland, I went there every single day, and I did some trainings for them before it even happened. And it was mind-numbing how often they revisited decisions. It's like, no, that's just so ineffective. It's like an agent provocateur could not have done better. No, we have to rethink this. No, we already thought it. And this is what we're doing. If you don't like it, we love you, but please stay away. Just go ahead, because keeping a campaign moving forward is kind of important. If you have to revisit things, and I'm not suggesting that iterative management, which is what the ecologists call it, is not a good program. You do want to revisit, reevaluate, and rethink things, but not some basic things. Rethink a tactic that might have worked or might not have worked, but you don't revisit the initial core decisions that you make.
The next is a bit of a comment talking about advertising protests on social media, and then it's kind of a come one, come all, and you get pretty much every flavor of participation. The comment here being anyone with different agendas show up, some without agendas coming out of bars, do their own thing, conflicts with the right wing. So maybe you could just comment a little bit on, you want to get large numbers for a rally or a mass demonstration, but what are the influences of social media? How do you do that without risking attracting folks that are not helpful?
Yeah, once again, I think that has to be part of, like, when you make a poster, that simple behavior code should be in there. And all of that's one of the conditions that we ask for. The Portland Peace Team will not go out unless the group says, well, yeah, we've been promoting this as a peaceful event or family-friendly event or nonviolent event or whatever. If they haven't been, then we're at your stated problem, Bruce. I think that's, or whoever asked that really good question, is that and this is what I mean about being kind of relentless in not worrying about being redundant, is that you just always, anything that you're putting out there, you've got nonviolence or peaceful or whatever. The second piece to that is having a peace team that's on hand to say, the organizers have been asking for this all along, please, and they've asked us to be here to help remind you of that. I mean, we're very respectful to people, but we are also intent on reminding them. One of the things that we ask, we don't require this, but we recommend to organizers, is that they, from the megaphone or from the stage, from the mic, say to people, we're asking you not to respond to hecklers. Don't argue or debate with the counter demonstrators. Just ignore them. That removes kind of all the power that they're seeking. They want you to engage, and that always escalates. And the wonderful piece, when we can convince them to do that, then that gives us another tool. And we have used it. It was started by one of our peacekeepers is a Palestinian-American woman named Soraya. And she was the first one to adopt this. She heard one woman from Nasty Women Get Shit Done. And we always go out whenever they ask us to go out. And one of their organizers said that from the stage, or maybe with the microphone, I don't know. But she heard this and she started using it. And she said, this is really effective. Because every time we go out, we have a debrief. And what do we learn? What do we do wrong? And that was one of the key learnings in the past couple of years, is that when we can convince organizers to say that out loud, then we have the tool. Then we can focus on, quote, our people and say, the organizers have asked us to remind you, please don't respond to this. That has successfully de-escalated a lot. It takes two to tango, right?
Right. Tom, thank you very much. I want to, first off, applaud. Everybody's on
Thank
mute,
you.
so it's going to be silent clapping. But thank you very, very much for all of your wisdom, and you're sharing the stories from your own life and from the things that you've seen that have worked, as well as the theory and such. What I'd like from the participants, just a final thing before we close, in the Mike Yarrow Peace Fellowship, we've come to call this fist to 5. Let me get my fist out here. On a scale of 0 to 5, you'd hold up your fingers. 0 would be, yeah, it really wasn't all that helpful. I didn't learn very much. And 5 would be, this was really helpful. I got as
Wait a
much out
second.
of this as I think I could.
Would you like me to leave then? Seriously, before you do this. It might be helpful to you if I did.
All right.
Say goodbye to you.
We'll say sayonara, and then we'll get an assessment on the.
I really want to thank you and everybody.
Thank you very much.
Turn, turn, we gotta turn, turn, we gotta turn, turn, we gotta turn, turn. We gotta seas are rising, but the struggle is long. We're gonna turn history, turn it around. And the CEO's got money, but our union is strong. We're gonna move history, move it along. We're gonna turn history, turn it around. We're gonna turn history, turn it around. We're gonna turn history and turn it around.